Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for being here. I'm really excited about this session, Closer to the Final Frontier, question mark. And so we're going, everything from space mining to satellite connectivity, new space stations, Earth sensing, it's pushing the limits of technology. And we're here to talk about sort of what the new possibilities these advances bring to society and what the sector will look like in the next decade. And I think Rajeev and I have talked about this, but it's, there are, on the one hand, there's space exploration, which I think for a lot of people is exciting and inspiring, but maybe not for everyone. And then on the other hand, I think people see space as a playground for billionaires. And in between, there are the rest of us, and sort of, how is space shaping our lives? How is it going to impact us? I think that's something I'd like to explore here. So. But to start, I'd like to introduce Josef Aschbacher, who is the Director General of the European Space Agency. He's going to invite you to stand up and say a few remarks to set the stage for us. So, thank you.
No, thank you. Thank you, Alison. Just a couple of remarks before we really go into a very interesting discussion. So what is the final frontier of space? And question mark, as Alison was saying. There are many aspects of it. Of course, one thinks always of the final frontier in terms of the universe, James Webb Space Telescope, exploring our universe, Jupiter, Saturn, and all the planets, or going to Mars, or going to the moon, or going to the space station. Of course, these are the frontiers of space we are thinking of when we talk about space. And there's a lot happening, and you all know what's happening, and this is changing our way of seeing space quite significantly in the next couple of years, certainly in the next couple of years, if not within the next decade. But there's also other frontiers where space is playing a fundamental role of how we live and how our living standard is guaranteed. And let me take just the obvious ones, which we are using every single day, which are the so-called space applications, which is Earth observation, navigation, and telecommunications. And if you would imagine your day or one day without satellites, your life would be very different. You would probably not find the place here with no navigation. You would not be able to communicate properly without satellite communication. Earth observation brings a lot of information you need in daily life, from weather forecasts to all the other sectors, from agriculture, forestry, ship routing, and many others. So this is more the obvious ones where space is already entering deep into society. But there are the less obvious ones. Let me mention energy as one example. Where do we put photovoltaics? Where do we put other renewable energy sources? Space traffic management is another one, or traffic management on the ground, or financial transactions is another example, which is not obvious, but of course space plays a crucial role. And then there are some hidden applications or uses or evolutions of space, which is that in the space industry, we're using more and more COTS. That means components off the shelf, which are making space completely different in terms of cost and the way how we work, and not developing every single component from scratch and to space standards, of course, but we use components from the automotive industry, for example, which are tested in a different environment, but also good for space. So this is changing the way how we work in terms of cost and approach, but also in the use of space. Mm-hmm. But I think, and then I would hand back to Alison, but we should really think about this in terms of final frontier. Where do we see space going in the next 10 years, or by the end of this decade, beginning of next decade? I think if you could keep this in mind in terms of frontier or final frontier, I think this would be important. But one last word on my side, and this is something that is very much down to earth. I think space also has to help in the biggest crisis we have, and I'm not talking of the war, and I'm not talking of the inflation and the energy crisis. The biggest crisis of our planet still is climate change and preserving our own climate, and I think our own planet. And I think this is something where space can also play an enormous role, and I leave it to the panel to really reflect on this and make some comments. So thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to set the scene with a few remarks.
Thank you. Thanks so much. I'd like to introduce the panel. I'm not sure if I was supposed to do that first, but sorry. So directly next to me is Sarah Al-Amiri. She's the Minister of Public Education and Advanced Technology of the United Arab Emirates, and you're also a World Economic Forum Young Global Leader. Thank you for being here. Thank you. Next to her is Dava Newman. She is the Director of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology's Media Laboratory. Thank you. And Rajeev Suri, you are the Chief Executive Officer of Inmarsat Global, based in the UK. And on the very end is Dylan Taylor. He's the Chairman and Chief Executive Officer of Voyager Space. Oh, and you are also a WEF Young Global Leader. Cool. So thank you all for being here. And I guess I want to pick up first on something Joseph just said, which is looking at opportunities for growth. Where do you see the biggest opportunities for growth? The space economy, it grew 8% last year, even though there were some pretty big economic headwinds. So I'm hoping each of you can just, in the broadest sense, where do you see the biggest opportunities for growth, in whether it be in the next few years or in the next decade? So I'm going to start with you, Sarah.
Yeah, I'll speak from the perspective of an emerging space nation, and what are the opportunities for entering into the space sector today as an emerging space nation. The first is leveraging quite remarkably on the transformation that technology has undergone in space, be it on the up-and-coming new private space sector players to existing and long-standing space sector players, and the heritage and the play between the two has created immense opportunity, be it in exploration, all the way to utilization of space data, and all the way to building new systems in a different way than we've known them before. And that's one area that the Emirates has capitalized on, the development of its own space sector, and been able to select where it could create the maximum form of impact. And this diversity that we're seeing today in the sector, and these different mechanisms where we see long-standing space agencies transform the way they do business together with their own, with the private sector, and then having emerging space agency come in and up-and-coming new space economies across the world to bridge into this global, the global value chain of space becomes important. I want to segue into something that Joseph said, which is the frontier, or is it the final frontier? The examples that were just given are quite broad in the sense that space is becoming inevitably a tool to be utilized across all sectors. And when that becomes the case, it's no longer a frontier. It becomes a vital technology for development and transformation moving forward. And it's our planet that we need to double down and focus on over the course of the next few years to know if any measures we're taking for sustainability and to combat climate change to get to that 1.5 degrees is actually effective or not. And this is something that I think all of the players here and all the players across the space sector need to actively work together with the wider global community to create this impact.
Is that like an important psychological shift, I guess? Is that what you're putting your finger on there?
I always so we all see each other in the space sector quite a lot and speak to each other, and we know exactly where to pinpoint what we want to do and how we want to develop it. But it's taking the space sector into something that is as usable as a mobile phone, something that's accessible to people, something that's understood, but make it at the policy spectrum and at the mechanism to actually drive change. And it's that role that we need to take on ourselves as onus, but we need to bring in more people from different sectors to know how to utilize the space sector as not its own standalone mechanism of driving exploration or getting Earth observation data, or packaging what we have all in our phones. For example, the GPS has been packaged in such a way that it's now usable to people. It's more about having a better collaborative process with different sectors to get better products and services out of space, to actually realize its potential and be able to create the necessary impact moving forward.
Get it.
Thank you. So a few points. The democratization of space is democratized, and that's fantastic. It's for everyone. And for all countries that have space agencies, a lot are developing, but it's for everyone. When I was at NASA, we sent an elementary school designed and developed a CubeSat to space. Why? Just to say, it's for everyone. It's for all kids. It's for everyone. The data is the currency. So space data, that's the future currency. So that's where the economic impact. But I just want to make sure that it really has been flattened. Access is there in different ways. Human spaceflight is always very expensive, but so that's not as available to everyone, but we'll be going from the democratization, living and working in, close low Earth orbit, 400 kilometers up. We've been doing that for 40, 50 years now. I'm at MIT, I'm the Apollo program professor. We're going back to the moon. The Artemis launch was huge. But guess what? We're going back internationally. And that's the important thing. Everyone any country, if you're in industry and you're not in the space sector, should be a wake-up call. You need to be in the space. How are you? I think the question for you is, how are you participating in the space sector? What works for your companies? And I bring it back to my students as an educator. We're on the commercial lunar missions. The students are developing the next payloads. And we're going to the moon to stay. And I think out further, of course. I push for human missions to Mars. Why? That doesn't make any economic sense. Because that's what Apollo taught me, to dream, to push our technology as far as we could. And very fundamentally, why did we go to Mars? We've been there 50 years with our rovers and robots. Again, we do it internationally. We all collaborate. We share open data across anyone who wants to work with us on these big international missions. And to Mars precisely is in exploration, are we alone? Mm-hmm. Are there other Earth-like planets? The evidence is mounting. And when will we find life? And so that's specifically, those are the scientific questions that open up, and the expansiveness. I believe, in the next decade, we will find the evidence of life, maybe past life on Mars, because we have the chemistry. So we have to find that out. We need those samples to come back, and we need to send people. And our Ocean Worlds missions, if people know, could be teeming with life, because when there's water, in a moon or a planet, that's life. Follow the water. That's where life lies. So to me, that's where we're going in the future, and that's the inspiration, and that's the dream, and it'll raise all of our capabilities up.
Great, that's inspiring.
Yeah, very good. I think from my point of view, the biggest commercial opportunities, if you're a company that sort of builds and launches satellites, aviation. Mm-hmm. So we all expect an in-flight Wi-Fi experience that's kind of like our home or on the move. That's a 20% growth market. It's probably the fastest growing market within what you call mobility sector, which is connecting movable assets, any assets that move. Industrial IoT, far-flung areas, especially agriculture, transportation, utilities. Think about precision agriculture and so on. And these are not high bandwidth applications. They're a lot of transactions, but low bandwidth applications. But you need that to be able to predict where a wildfire might occur in California and so on. So utilities needed for that. The direct to mobile phone opportunity. Mm-hmm. So many telecom companies don't want to go and cover 100% population coverage in nations because it's not economical to put towers and backhaul and all of that. And then you can actually do that last, 20%, 25% through satellite, but then from a user point of view, it's on the device. So these are, I think, the growth opportunities. Obviously, helping the maritime industry digitalize is another, strong growth. There has to be a 70% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions when it comes to the maritime sector. It's a big emitter. But I think if you step back from all the commercial opportunities, the big one's decarbonization. I really think, as you said, Joseph, that the big opportunity is decarbonization. We did a survey last year together with a company called Global Sustainability Studio, and we assessed that there are the satellite industry reduces 1.5 billion tons out of the 51 billion tons that are emitted every year. 1.5 billion tons is already reduced through the satellite industry. By the way, most people are not aware of it. If you go to COP27, nobody's talking about the space sector's benefits in decarbonization, so it is not on policymakers' agenda. We reckon that if you use the currently available technologies more widely across at least the energy systems, the agriculture, forestry, land use, as well as the transportation and logistics sector, which is only 60% of global greenhouse gas emissions, you could take that 1.5 billion tons reduction per annum, which, by the way, is equal to UK, Germany, and France combined every year in terms of emissions reduction. So you can take it from 1.5 to 5.5 billion tons, which is about 10% of reduction in emissions. I'm saying technology is available today that you can actually utilize more widely. And then if you look at new technologies, like I think we've partnered with European Space Agency to modernize the air traffic systems through trajectory-based operations so that you can optimize for more green routes and routes that have less fuel consumption. You can take that 5.5 billion number to 8.8 billion tons reduction every year, which is 18% of total greenhouse gas emissions every year, which means you can bring forward net zero from 2050 to maybe by at least 5 years, maybe even 10 years. Mm-hmm. So I think that's the biggest opportunity for the space sector, one of the biggest ones, the big one.
I want to come back to the decarbonization and how that works, and but Dylan.
Well, I agree with everything that's been said. Maybe just to be a little bit further out there, if the last 10 years, let's say the 2010s, were about access to space, reusable, reliable launch, I think we did a pretty good job. We've built the elevator, so to speak. I think the 2020s are going to be about destinations. So where are we actually going? Certainly back to the moon. I look forward to having the first female land on the moon and put their steps on the moon. But I also think, we have, in my opinion, one of the best assets humans have ever created, which is the International Space Station. I'm in the camp that thinks it deserves a Nobel Peace Prize. I think it's one of the best things humans have ever done. We have people in the audience who've actually spent time on it. However, it's aging. And it's likely to be deorbited around 2030, perhaps even earlier than that. We had a pretty bad leak in the Russian module last year, unanticipated. So it's aging, so we need to replace these. So how do we do that? Well, the idea would be to use the same model we use on the launch side, which is to commercialize that. But if we commercialize it, it has to be in the spirit of what we did with the ISS. It has to be through international partnership. It needs to include all nations. It needs to make sure that employment and inspiration and all the things that the ISS does well is recreated in that vein as well. However, what's the upshot? The upshot is we can get much more laboratory space built, right? We can custom build these space stations for specific uses. And as valuable as the ISS is, it's a bit difficult to do business on the ISS. It was sort of a hodgepodge. It was assembled over time. You might have an astronaut on a treadmill next to a thin film experiment. That's not ideal, right? So we can purpose-build these stations for uses, including research. And back to Alison, what you said earlier, we go to space to benefit Earth, but very few people actually understand that. But things like drug development, things like space manufacturing, for technologies that can only be made in space, not to mention the inspiration, right? The inspiration of people tweeting from the space station and talking about the overview effect and all the things that our young people, I think, need to hear. But I can't stress enough, this cannot be a commercial venture focused on a specific country. It needs to be international cooperation. It needs to be the best of humanity. And so when I fast forward to the end of the 2020s, I see at least 2 stations up there, and hopefully they'll be the best examples of what the ISS does well, but also the commercial sector does well.
So I'm going to bring us back to today, and since I'm a journalist, I'm going to pop the bubble. And the sort of big but here is that for startups, last year was like a pretty rough year for space startups. There was a report actually just this morning from Space Capital about how the investment dropped by 58% between the 2 years. And they're talking about how the focus is sort of away from momentum investment to going back to the fundamentals. So what are those fundamentals? And I guess who would be sort of, what can non-traditional space investors, where can they get involved? What can they do? And I open that to anyone.
I'll take a stab at it. First of all, I'm not sure those numbers are necessarily correct. They're very sensitive to how much investment goes into SpaceX, because SpaceX overwhelms those numbers.
It's like a third, I think it said in the...
Yeah, exactly. So I'm not so sure that's the most reliable source. That being said, it's obviously a difficult market. As was said earlier, the easiest thing for investors to underwrite are ones and zeros, right? Data monetization models. And we're right on the cusp of being able to unlock a lot of those applications, as was mentioned earlier. And I think having those returns more near and present will unlock capital. The second thing we need to do as an industry is reduce the number of, we call them flameouts. And unfortunately, we've had a lot of companies that launched and didn't fulfill their original mission. And I think what ends up happening is investors then get disillusioned with the sector. Mm-hmm. We definitely need, I think, clearer guidance, not to put it back on the space agencies, but the demand signal can vary. And I think what the market would like to know is what specifically do the agencies need and when? Now, oftentimes the agencies can't declare that because they have budgetary cycles and whatnot. But the more precise the agencies can be and the more consistent the agencies can be as to what the priorities are, the easier it is for the public markets and the private investors to underwrite it. So I'm actually quite optimistic. I see this as a blip. If you look at the trend line, it's still very, very, very steeply to the right.
Okay.
And we're not really, as an industry, capital constrained right now. I don't see that. I really don't.
Okay. I want to go back to decarbonization because all of you have touched on it. And just maybe can you talk about exactly how that's happening? I mean, the statistic you gave is pretty remarkable. Can you talk about how? Like what? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so we've worked with a company called 0 Point North, it's based in Denmark, to work with our merchant marine customers to be able to, match their algorithms with market vessel bunkering and weather data to be able to navigate green routes, optimize the routes for more profitable routes, lower fuel consumption, and just green routes. So that's one thing, one example that I can give in that industry. I just mentioned the air traffic modernization example. I mean, it's pretty old, and you need to modernize it, and it's possible if the product that we talk about is called Iris, that we partnered with the European Space Agency for. It's possible to get a third of airliners have that in place by 2030, and maybe all of the airlines have that in place by 2038. And that's remarkable because you can even get flights flying close to each other but safely, as long as you're optimizing for green routes. So a lot of it is about, because transportation and logistics is such a big part of that 60% number I gave, and so you have to affect that in a meaningful way. Same kinds of use cases for energy systems, use cases for doing it more cleverly in utility industry and so on. So I mean, it's across the board. There are a number of use cases that the technology is available. I think it's just about awareness. It's about the vertical industries that we serve, taking it on as a mission and getting it done. And by the way, it'll also help in the path to digitization, right? If you're going to get more green routes, if you're going to fly safely, if you're going to fly quicker to places, these are all other benefits as well of digitalization. And so I think there are a lot of examples. Can you believe it? You can get from 1.5 billion tons to 5.5 billion tons, which is about 10% of reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, just by widely using those technologies available today in just 60% of the emitting producing industries. I'm not even talking about the remaining 40% because we didn't fully assess that. Energy systems, agricultural land use and forestry, as well as transportation logistics.
Go ahead.
On the end of digitization, we're especially across industries that are championing the net carbon zero. Space technologies are not usually in the roster of your typical technologies to be adopted.
Exactly.
To monitor. And that's what I meant about accessibility, and you just touched up on that. The more we make, and space does not have a seat, like you said, in the COP engagements, most custodians of those key sectors that have the onus of reducing their carbon footprint are not aware of how to utilize space technologies. And one thing that we're trying to do, I was just talking to Joseph prior to beginning this, is in COP28, which will be hosted in the Emirates, to have outside the panel, but to have a space showcase, to come in and say that this is what the space sector can do and this is what these technologies can play a part of. It cannot stand on its own. The space sector will not give you the solution, but the space sector coupled with digitization across different sectors will give you that final edge to be able to reduce, like you said, instead of 2050, to bring it back down and be able to meet the commitment prior to the self-imposed deadline that we've all placed on ourselves.
Go ahead.
Just add to that because I agree 100%. And so it's bridging. We have to now space is there, and it's about the data, our Earth observing data. So I call them, the vital signs, not just carbon. It's methane. It's so we have these. We're taking all these measurements. So we have that. Can we get it in real time? The data is the easy part. Space, climate, for health. These are all interrelated. And then it's really about changing human behavior. It's not about the technology at the end of the day. It's about how do we, bring about action. action when it comes to climate. How do you change human behavior? But having that data literally in your pocket, your climate pocket calculator that comes to you from space data, then you can do something. It has to be local. How do you do it in your own community? How do we do it from, what scale? Locally, it comes from, space, but I look at it across the whole spectrum of the local communities taking action, but they need to be empowered. And that's where, our space data can really help.
It also goes back to your question of investment. A lot of the investment down the line that will eventually come is not from the space sector itself to grow the space sector. It would eventually come from demand outside the space sector that will then implicate the growth of the sector. And this is what I think all of us are indirectly working towards to be able to achieve that.
And to be clear, we also have a role as an industry to communicate better, what can be achieved. So we don't want to just put the blame on other policymakers and so on, but we also have a role. And as you said, Sarah, the problem cases are there. You just got to match them with the solutions, then you get the use cases. So it's not rocket science, no pun intended.
It is, but it's complex systems. And that's why it's so difficult, I think, to communicate. Yes. Because there's no silver bullet. There's no solution. So, to me, it's actually, we take the oceans, land, air, space. I love that you mentioned aviation and space. Space isn't so special anymore. We're low Earth orbit. It's just part of the realm. And we're there, and we're going to continue to be there. Well, I see a lot of people there and see manufacturing, but I love that you put, I'm taught as an aerospace engineer, it used to be aviation and space. No, it's all the continuum.
Right.
Yeah.
It's just all the continuum now.
Dava, for sure. And then the other convergence, you mentioned IoT earlier. So if you think about all these technologies that are becoming more advanced, edge computing, cloud computing, AI, Internet of Things, getting data down from space. So we now have laser comm technologies and things that bypass the K-band, so you can actually get terabytes of data down. And you mash all those technologies together, that's when, as Sarah is alluding to, that's when you get these emerging applications that are unanticipated, right? I think we've all played, and we've talked about ChatGPT this week. I've used it, it blew my mind. I think that's like AI 101. So when we see what these unstructured data sets are going to lead to, when we actually put some of these technologies to work, I think it's going to unlock a lot of use cases we don't anticipate.
Right. Hinges on lots of satellites, though, right? How many? So, Rajeev, that's a question for you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Touching my favorite subject. So, I think in 2014 there were 1,400 satellites in orbit. This year there are about 7,000 satellites in orbit. I think fully funded plans suggest that there'll be 100,000 by the end of this decade. The filings are for a lot more than 100,000. And of course, the issues to be concerned about. We've learned from climate change. You've got to think before you act as an industry. And so I think there are three issues in my mind. One is orbital exclusion. If there's a company or a country that wants to launch a mega constellation in one or two orbits, it might be monopoly formation in that orbit. Nobody else can get a chance to get in. And that's a real problem because many countries have plans in space strategies and so on. The second is collision avoidance. We have already about 900,000 objects in the orbits traveling at 10 kilometers a second, more than a centimeter in diameter. So all it takes is, you and I were talking, a speck of paint to hit a satellite and you get collisions. And the risk is, the theoretical risk has always been of this Kessler syndrome, which is collisions lead to more collisions and it takes a life of its own. And it's not theoretical anymore if you're going to have 100,000 satellites so close to Earth, because we're talking a lot of them are in low Earth orbit, and that's between 400 kilometers to about 1,200 kilometers. And then there are tools and there are solutions for these, by the way. There are recommendations that we can do. We can't just complain about it. There are ways to act. And then, the third issue is so much metal burning up, creating alumina in the Earth's upper atmosphere means that there are issues for us here on Earth. So you can't get sustainability on Earth without sustainability in space. And so we have to worry about that as well. Things like what happens to astronomy and sort of all of the things, right? So you already have about 1 million objects up in space. You're going to add more. And then anti-satellite testing and weapon testing and so on. That if US suggested a moratorium on that and they're not going to do it, but if other countries still do it, there are some objects in space, debris, that is 50 years old. That are 50 years old. So don't think that if a collision happens, it'll go away in 2 or 3 years. Some will. Most will stay for decades.
And this makes this a global problem.
Absolutely.
And I think a lot of us are shying away in the space sector from politicizing space, because what's happening up there is going to impact every single person on this planet.
100%.
From getting access to vital technologies that are meant to drive and transform cooperation moving forward. There are measures. I think a lot of us have spoken about measures. And I think the criticality that we've reached in the space sector in this decade is if we don't sort it out right now, we'll be in the exact same situation as the COP28 discussions that are not effectively getting us to an active solution. So it is a call for action, I think, in a purposeful sense, call for action for all major players and also emerging players to be able to find solutions to the cluttering that's happening in low Earth orbit.
There's a saying that what happens in space is a reflection of what's happening on Earth. It's a pretty fractured world. So how does that bode for space?
Yeah, so we'll, two sides. So soft diplomacy, International Space Station was mentioned before, has been the best example of international folks with very different ideology, but working together and really dependent, very, very dependent on one another. And so that's a great example. And so I'm pushing for soft diplomacy, and that's what especially human spaceflight does. To raise everyone up and let's do this together, and that's a choice. These are choices. The flip side is that they sat the anti-sat, and there was a very recent anti-sat occurrence. And what can we do with policy and regulation and global? No, it's not one country for sure, because this is very damaging. And I would, you can go further. Responsibility. Let's just call it what it is. The U.S. and Russia and China and India have all done anti-satellite maneuvers. It's not okay for the future because, as Sarah says, it compromises everyone. So the U.S. has backed off of that. So we have to have a serious discussion. That's the downside of it. What is the regulation? What are the policies? How can we all come together and agree? Some are defensive moves, and we're talking civil mostly here. But there's definitely downsides.
I can give a question that policymakers need to ask themselves prior to bringing any sector into your global political repertoire. Is it something that needs to, if it's something that needs to be sustained well beyond this current skirmish that's going to last, 1-2 years, a decade, differences in principles? If the answer is yes, this is a space, pun intended, required for the long run, then it should not be in the repertoire of political movements. I mean, we've got enough tools to address global skirmishes. We cannot create a further problem to solve a current problem. And this is what's happening in the space sector. We need to remain actively and consciously and transparently that space is for peaceful use, and the low Earth orbit, which is the orbit that we will require the most, is a finite commodity that needs to be accessible for everyone. And if we do not act positively from today, it's going to eventually get to a point where we lose a major technology that can advance so many different sectors.
Yeah, I love what you said.
Please.
Space is not infinite. Let's remember that. So this finite commodity point. But by the way, I propose 3 recommendations, right? Because we just can't complain as an industry. We've got to recommend. So I propose number 1, when national regulators give market access, that is the point in time where you ask for, what's your satellite debris removal plan? What are you going to do about space situational awareness? What are you going to do about deorbiting? All of those things can be enforced at that point in time. That's probably the strongest thing you can do to enforce. Because self-regulation doesn't work. We've seen it with climate change. And then the second is a few forward-thinking space nations should come together to agree on basic minimum standards. Right? This is not great because this needs self-regulation. It's voluntary, but still that will help. And the third is the International Telecommunication Union, the ITU, which has had a spectrum mandate for the longest ever time, can also expand their budget and their mandate to look at space debris removal plans and so on. So I think there are technologies available, there are solutions available. We need the willing to get on with it.
Are you hopeful for any movement?
I'm hopeful. It'll take time. I'm hopeful. I don't think we should be fearful of space because then the benefits of space that we have all talked about won't happen. But I think there is no place for 100,000 or 200,000 satellites in the next few years. I think that's economically overcapacity. By the way, I think the industry will get to overcapacity in terms of sheer satellite capacity available by maybe even 2025. And 2030 will be an excessive overcapacity situation. So while I like the new investment coming into the sector, I get it, but there are too many mega constellations being planned at the moment. I'm not against innovation. I actually want innovation to happen. I believe in a multi-orbit race, but it just can't be indiscriminate.
But do you worry about losing business for
Losing business?
Yeah, losing business.
If it's overcapacity, of course I worry about losing business. Of course I worry about value leaking and all of those things, and this thing getting commoditized. I don't think that's why we believe in a multi-orbit. We're a geostationary orbiter player in Inmarsat. We think we will do LEO as well. We believe we'll do LEO as well, but I want to do 10,000 LEO satellites. I don't need that. I think we'll complement our global coverage and capacity with sensible hotspot coverage with maybe 150, 200 satellites for LEO. I think that's good enough for someone like us. I just don't know what you do with one player doing 30 to 40,000 satellites. And by the way, lifetime of some of these satellites that are 400 kilometers above Earth is 5 years.
Right.
Remember that.
And I think part of the issue also, Alison, is not only the competitive forces, but you can literally pollute an orbit, right? Some of these preferred orbits, if something really bad happens and you have a cascade event, we can literally pollute an orbit, and then that orbit's no longer available for anybody. And so it really is tragic, and I do think this is an area, I totally agree with Rajeev, we need more regulation in this regard. So not to pick any particular country, but imagine a region or a country just simply says any hardware launched from our soil has to have deorbit technology on it. Full stop.
Absolutely.
That's the rule. The market would then have to adapt to come up with solutions for that. So I think that's one possible solution. Second possible solution is we probably do need a little bit of seed money, the industry, to further develop some of these space debris removal technologies. There's companies working on things like dragnets and other things. The market probably isn't there without a little bit of government help, but this is classic tragedy of the commons, right? Everyone's incremental risk is low, but if everyone thinks that, then the collective risk is very high.
Right.
So I think that's another area where we can co-invest, perhaps, and maybe even get some philanthropic capital, the right kinds of people who understand this is an issue, and get it cleaned up. But then make sure we're not contributing to more debris.
I want to go to the audience, see if you have any questions in 2 seconds. So if you have a question, think about it. And I'm going to ask you to stand, and there'll be a mic that comes around. But I have a question for you, Sarah. I'm really curious about how you see the UAE's position geopolitically in space. You're sort of straddling the US and China. Can you just talk a little bit about that?
So we're respectful of each country's need to segregate technology from the get-go. We're establishing right now within our space agency an export office. It also looks at the legalities of imports into the country and ensures that those are properly segregated. In terms of commercial space at the moment, the way we're looking at it is where the opportunities are in terms of growth opportunities that will impact our commercial space sector and be able to benefit other sectors. We also look at capability development and have various partners around the world to look at that. In terms of geopolitics, we believe that space is not a space for geopolitical discussions. It's a space to honor and respect the perspectives of the different partners that we have around the world. We are a nation that's neutral in terms of global perspectives, and we collaborate with a solid understanding and respect for the values that each nation holds, the values that we hold as a nation, and be able to collaborate in that way and grow from that perspective. It's a bit different than the polarized world that we're living in, sometimes not very well understood of why we're doing this, but it goes back into this long-term perspective that these are large economies, large nations around the world. You can't just ignore each other.
Any questions in the audience? If you have one, you can just raise your hand, stand up, we'll give you the mic. Anybody? No? There we go. He's gonna give you a mic here, 1 second.
Live. Sorry, I thought I was in the front row. I could speak loudly enough.
There's a live stream too, so.
Kathy Bloomgarden from the U.S. I'm head of a communication agency. The question for Rajeev is actually, you mentioned the airline industry. Well, we've had a lot of problems recently in the U.S. in terms of FAA, technology being old and holiday problems in terms of weather disruptions. What can be done short term, if anything, that connects with the technology you have?
Ooh, I'm not sure I would know the exact answer to that question. Is anybody else? Joseph, do you know something about that? Right.
Not an applicable.
I'm not sure satellite necessarily will be coming to the rescue.
Okay, so let me have another question on biotech. You mentioned biotech. What area were you thinking of, and what more specifically would be done in that area?
Yeah, sure. So Matthias, ESA astronaut's in the audience. He does a better job explaining it than I do. But when you think about drug development on Earth, essentially it's a two-dimensional system, like if you're in a petri dish, for example. And if you want to simulate what those drugs do to the human body, you need a three-dimensional system. So that's typically animal studies or human studies, if you can get approval for that. Neither one are really ideal. But when you take gravity away, which is essentially a convective force, and chemistry is all about convection, of course, you can actually simulate those three dimensions. So drug development is enhanced in two ways. One is you get that three-dimensional look. Things like protein folding and all that are all in three dimensions. And secondly, it's almost a little bit like a slow motion machine, because you can actually see how reactions catalyze much clearer when you take microgravity into the mix. There have actually been quite a few drugs developed on station over the years, and they're not well understood. I think the industry doesn't do a great job of talking about those stories. But again, the lab space on the ISS is quite constrained. It's constrained for a couple of reasons. One is there's not enough lab space, and secondly, it's very dependent on astronaut time, which is scheduled down to the minute. So if we expand habitat in space and it's purpose-built for research, and we get the right researchers in space who are doing this full time and not having to do spacewalks repairing the ISS, my thesis, and others share it, is we're going to get a lot more breakthrough technologies with that type of setup.
Yeah, I can just add on a little bit to that. The whole medical industry or biomedical, because of weightlessness, and so we have huge opportunities. And so groundwork's been laid with the International Space Station, but now when we have private space stations, those would be laboratories, and industry will come. We need to probably mention materials as well. We've thought for a long time it'll be the pharmaceuticals or the drug development or biomedical or material science, for the same reasons. It's weightlessness. You can grow a perfect crystal. So it might be the same. Maybe it's a perfect new material that actually has a drug development application. So those are the big bets, and there'll be more, that may be unanticipated ones, but we're just at the beginning of kind of this journey, and each astronaut runs, what do we run on your mission, 250 or so experiments? Mm-hmm. Yeah, about 250 experiments, each astronaut for a 6-month mission. So we're giving it our all, but just imagine when there's not only 6 people there, 7 people there. We have thousands of people there, and we really do, just be again a laboratory for Earth applications. Mm. So we know a lot about astronauts go through a lot of muscle and bone loss. So from the bone loss perspective, again, the pharmaceuticals, the bisphosphonates for osteoporosis here on Earth. You can identify the biomarkers, really important when you're with. So some really important research for on our astronauts, of course, but really for health and wellness here for Earth.
Mm-hmm. We have just a few minutes, so I'm going to ask you really quickly down the line, picking up on something you were all just saying. What's something that you can't, because you talked a lot about things you can do in space, the tools that are there. What's something that you can't do in space today, but you hope, or better yet, will bet you can do in the next, I don't know, you put the time on it, 5, 10 years. I'll start on the end.
Oh boy. I come from the camp that says everyone should be able to see the Earth from space. And I had the privilege of doing that myself. It is a life-changing event. So if we could somehow simulate that, and I don't know how we can do it, maybe it's some kind of metaverse weightless experience. But if somehow we could do that, I don't think we can scale going to space right now. But if we could do it, in the intellectual sense, I think that'd be very powerful.
Cool.
I think today you can't you can't sort of make a big impact in the digital divide through space. The economics are not yet in place to serve a lot of unconnected people through satellite services. So consumer broadband, you're not there terrestrially, 4G or 5G technologies with the economics, handset, affordability issue, and so on. In the case of satellites, even though some people are trying to do that with mega LEO constellations, but just the cost of the antenna, the cost of the dish that you need to have to receive the terminal is going to be a bottleneck, plus the average revenue you'll need from every user to justify that spend on the constellation is not going to get there. So I think that's a complex problem we need to sort of together still solve, because we need to get there. There are many billions of people still not connected, and we know when people get connected, great things happen. GDPs, economies grow up, productivity will go up, and so on.
Yeah. I would just add as a synergy, because I agree with both these, and they're great comments, is how do we open up space to the world? Literally, not everyone's going to fly. How do we open it up, the experience? So for me, it's educational. I want to take everyone with us on every mission, and we can, so you really feel that you're there, you're part of it, especially, all kids should feel that they can dream and they can contribute. So it's also citizen science. We have the experiments that we run. Everyone's on Jupiter with us. You develop, stars. You can get a star. So how do we just open it up so we know that everyone feels welcome? They have the data, and then how do we? It's not. I talked about democratization, but it's not equal. We don't have equity in space by a long shot because economics haven't worked out. Right. So if low Earth orbit, if that business case works for low Earth orbit, then it would be the next step. Then we really have to be very intentional about how it's equitable, because right now it's not.
Final word.
At solving the debris issue, but while still ensuring that equitable access to space. I think that's something that I'd love to get solved for the entire sector.
Great. Well, thank you. Thank you, everyone in the audience. Thank you, everybody watching online. And thank you to all of you for taking part in this.
Thank you.
Take care.